So this is what we're talking about today, the Atlantic slave trade and its effects. We're going to look at the causes of the slave trade, the process of slavery, and then the consequences of the slave trade. And this is, in my opinion, and most other historians, they will tell you, the slave trade is one of the most devastating and horrific world events that has ever taken place, that impacted the entire world in such a negative way. And that's why it's important that we understand causes and the process and consequences of it. All right, so let's set the stage. In North America and South America, they are using sugar plantations and tobacco farms, which require a lot of manual labor in order for them to turn a profit. You have to do a lot of work, you have to have a lot of people working, and in order to turn a profit, you need to not have to put out a lot of money for that. Originally in North and South America, they were using Native Americans as their labor, but millions of them died from disease, warfare, and brutal treatment. And so that was no longer working. Slavery had existed in Africa for centuries. So in Africa at this time, there are no countries, there are tribes. And when they would war with one another, whoever lost oftentimes became slaves to the ones that won. But it was on a very small scale. We're talking about just a little bit of slavery between the tribes. The Muslim traders that came in the 7th century, which is the 600s, they're going to increase slavery, and they're actually going to transport 17 million African slaves in a period of about 1,000 years, which is an obscene number of people to be taken from Africa. But in the system with the Muslims, they did allow the slaves to have legal rights, and they were able to move up to eventually buy their freedom. When we talk about slavery in the Americas, North and South America, there are no legal rights for slaves, and they cannot buy their way to freedom. Africans were immune to the diseases that killed the Native Americans, like smallpox killed the Native Americans in the millions. Africans had developed somewhat of an immunity to it, so it didn't devastate their populations as much. Africans had experience with farming because they were farmers in Africa before they were taken captive, whereas Native Americans did not do farming like that. And Africans were less likely to try to escape because once they brought them to North and South America, they didn't know the land, they didn't know the language, they didn't know where to hide, they stood out. Whereas Native Americans could blend in and they knew the land because it was their land before the Europeans came. By the end of the slave trade, we have more than 9.5 million Africans that are brought to the Americas. So if you add that to the 17 million from the Muslim transporters, we're looking at 27 million Africans that were taken into slavery. So these are called yokes. Yokes were a common practice. In order to keep slaves from running away, they tied their necks to another slave, and then they were chained to other people as well. And that meant that they were able to then keep them from escaping. So just like on Monday when we said that Spain and Portugal led the way for exploration, they definitely led the way with the transportation of slaves as well and made a lot of money doing it. Over 40% of the slaves that were taken to Brazil to work on the sugar plantations. But as England becomes more and more a part of the slave trade, we're going to see more and more slaves wind up in North America. The African slaves were broken up by tribes, and there were African rulers and merchants that captured other Africans and traded them for gold, guns, and goods. And you think, well, why would some Africans trade other Africans into slavery? In order to keep their tribe safe, they went out and found slaves to sell to the merchants so that the merchants wouldn't then try to take them as slaves. So it was purely an issue of survival. If you look here at this map, it's a really good representation of what was going on. On the pink area is Africa over to the side, and they took slaves only from this west area called the Gold Coast, where we find a lot of gold in Africa. The reason why is because they don't want to park their ships on the coast and then travel all the way into the middle, okay? That's a lot of work. You have to transport and feed the slaves then, and you could get attacked yourself. So they only took slaves from the West Coast countries, and a little bit on the east side. You see the orange there, but not much. And then they were taken over. And you can see only 4% went to North America at that time, okay? The majority are going down to Brazil, like I said, with the sugar plantations, and then 42% into the West Indies, which is the islands that are south of Florida. We call this the triangle trade, and I'm going to kind of jump back and forth here. So merchants would leave Great Britain, and they would sail down the coast of Africa around that horn there, and they would take slaves, and then they would go across to the islands and past South America, stopping if they needed to, and up to North America. And then they would sail home to Great Britain to sell the things they got in North America. So in Africa, they picked up the slaves and they gave them gold and guns. And then they took the slaves across the ocean to the Americas, and they traded them for sugar. They traded them for, sugar, tobacco, and coffee. And then they went back to Europe with the sugar, tobacco, and coffee and sold it in Great Britain. We call this area that what they did to get the slaves, to take the slaves across to the Americas. We call that the Middle Passage because it was the middle part of their journey when they were taking the slaves from Africa to the Americas. The Middle Passage was extremely dangerous. It was extremely volatile. Millions died on this voyage. They were whipped and beaten on the ships. They were starved. They were not treated for medical condition. They were living in horrible conditions of feces, dead bodies, and all sorts of horrific experiences for them. So roughly 20% of that 27 million that went across are going to end up dying on the journey itself. You can see from the layout of the ships how horrific the conditions were. They had the slaves laying down head to toe in order to create more room. They did not allow the slaves from the same tribes to be near one another because all these tribes spoke different languages. So they knew if they spread them out throughout the ship, that none of those people could then communicate and try and come up with a way of escaping or surviving because they didn't speak each other's languages. So they would separate families, they would separate people from their tribes, and it was truly terrifying. These people didn't know why they were being captured, where they were going. They didn't speak the language, they didn't understand what was happening, and they didn't know what was going to happen at the end of this journey. You can see in this artist drawing how they laid head to toe in order to fit more slaves into the ships, and they called that the coffin position. A lot of times they threw the captives overboard. They definitely threw them overboard if they died on the journey, but they also threw them overboard if they needed to send a message to the rest of them, don't cause any trouble or you're going to go overboard like these people, or if they did cause trouble, or if they simply were running out of food and water to feed the people, they would just start throwing them over, which is why the sharks followed the slave ships across the Atlantic Ocean. When they arrived in the Americas, they were auctioned off as property. They were not auctioned off as human beings. They broke up families. They were sold to different buyers, so children were taken from their parents. They were forced to work in mines, in fields, in homes as domestic servants. They were given very little food, and they lived in small huts. The slave owners did not take good care of the slaves by feeding them well or giving them medical care. They were forced to work long hours and suffered beatings, especially being whipped. And it was a lifelong condition. If you had a child as a slave, then your child was a slave as well. So in order to try and survive this, Africans used music and stories of their ancestors to kind of get through how horrible this condition was. They tried to resist by breaking tools or working slowly. Sometimes they ran away, although that was very dangerous because, again, they don't know the language or the land and they stand out. And they tried to revolt and rise up, but those ultimately failed. You can see the poster here that was advertised for the selling of Africans, and then there's a picture here of one of those sales. When they arrived, they were inspected. This was a humiliating experience for the slaves, and again, they don't know what anybody is saying to them. They don't understand what's happening. And then you've got people that are then going to come in and take the slaves back to their homes. They used branding of the slaves in order to ensure that if the slave ran away, they could be returned. or to make sure other people knew who the slave belonged to. So the consequences of the slave trade were pretty severe. It completely annihilated generations of entire tribes. And that's because they would come in and take the fittest or the healthiest members. So the young men and women and children were all taken away. The elderly and the sick were left, which meant they died off, and those tribes then their cultures were completely erased. Their families were torn apart, which means even to today, people with an African descent, it'll be difficult for them to trace their heritage because of this situation. This introduced guns to the African continent because they traded guns for slaves. Guns had not existed there. It was more of traditional warfare items. And it contributed to the economic power of the Americas. Any country in North or South America would not be as powerful as it is today without the slave trade, without the work that was done on the backs of the slaves. It did bring African culture to the Americas. So they brought art, music, religion, food to the Americas. And that has also created a large African American population in the Americas today, including mixed races, especially in South America, where European, South American, Native American, African American cultures are all mixed together through forced population. This is a movie called Amistad that I highly recommend because it is incredibly accurate as far as they show you how the slaves were taken from Africa. They show you the Middle Passage journey on the water, all the way through arrival in the United States, and how this group of Africans will win their freedom in a court battle in the United States. It's an older movie from the 90s, but it's actually very, very accurate if you want to see a visual representation of what took place. All right, so that is our lesson on the African slave trade. Tomorrow, you guys are going to have a worksheet that has a reading with it. I want you to remember to be very specific. It's going to say, give me 3 examples of such and such. I want you to actually do the reading and use the information you learned today to answer the question specifically. When it says specifically tell me how the African slaves were punished, don't just say they hit them. Like, that's not specific. I want you to use the reading that I post up with to see the information that you want to put on the worksheet. We are live on Monday. We are not live next Thursday because Mr. Rose and I have the vaccination that day, so we'll be live next Friday instead. So if you guys have questions, please, about the worksheet tomorrow, just please email me.